All right, we are live. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sara Marks, and with me today is I am the Assistant Director for Communications and User Experience here at UMass Lowell, and with me, back for her second live stream, is Amanda Rust, our Associate Director of Research and Learning. Good afternoon, Amanda.
Hello.
Oh, we have one person, which could just be one of us. But for those of you who are joining us, or if you're rewatching this later, you can leave your questions for us, and someone is paying attention, and we will make sure to answer any questions you have, even if we've answered them 50 million times. We like your questions. We want to help you. There is no dumb question. The only dumb question is, can I ask you a dumb question? Like, yes, please. The dumber, the better. Because this is our job. We want to make sure you have what you need, and you don't know if you don't ask. So ask away. Thank you for your patience. Last week, we did have to cancel the live stream sort of at the last moment because I got a cold, and it wasn't COVID. So that's like the blessing in disguise is it's not COVID. But we're back. I'm feeling much better. I have something liquid to coat the throat should something happen again, but we're ready to go. And this week we're going to discuss newspapers as research tools. We're going to go into a few of the big newspapers, and depending on how much time we have, we will talk about finding smaller newspapers. We will address a routine question about accessing the Lowell Sun, our local paper, and some of the hoops we have to go through right now that can change, but I want to make sure that our students know how to access it this semester when you're doing your research. But let's start with the value newspapers have to the research process. Obviously, they are valuable for finding out factual data about events or situations that are going on. The who, the what, when, where, why, how are often answered in questions and newspapers. But they have a purpose beyond that. Amanda, you have experience doing archives in historical research or collections. What's the value newspapers have for historical research?
Sure. I'm such a fan of historical newspapers, so my answer is endless, but I'll try to be reasonably concise. I think it's what I find most fascinating is that it is a way to see how people of a different time experienced and reported on important events of the time. And those are two different things, right? So you're in 1952, some sort of event happens. How do you experience it? And often newspapers, particularly smaller newspapers, are some of the only places we might have firsthand accounts of something. But then second, there's this question of how did people report on it, right? What was the flow of information in 1952? I'm not sure I can tell you off the top of my head, but understanding how newspapers operate at different points in time and how different newspapers had and still have different audiences is also an incredible glimpse, I think, into how humans at the time were experiencing information, but also exchanging information. It's a very vague answer.
It's not a vague answer. I think it does a lot of the heavy lifting for our historical knowledge of what happens. From various points of view, we weren't, I think the vast majority of people alive today weren't watching TV for the moon landing because we weren't alive. So we rely on the news sources that were reporting what happened to shape our knowledge of that. It brings up another important point, and that is bias within news reporting. And this is not a modern issue by any means. This is something that we called it yellow journalism in the 19th and early 20th century. But this sense of news sources having their own perspective that they want to promote. And we often think of the tabloid papers that way. But it's not. Even the major papers like the New York Times versus the Wall Street Journal versus even like our little local papers have a very strong perspective that they want you to agree with as their reader. And it's not usually that they're lying. bias is a really tricky position to see past. I think all of us have those intrinsic biases that are shaped by our perspectives of the world and our experiences in the world, but we do have to deal with nefarious biases attempting to influence our opinion of the world. And I think that some of the research that's been coming out about Fox News lately, that along the lines of the investigations into like the voting machines and the past national election we did a few years ago, how on the news they tried to tear down this one company that was providing these voting machines, but in their private communications, it was quite clear that the anchors didn't agree with this. They didn't see this through that filter. And that's really difficult to reconcile, that our personal opinions versus our public opinions have to clash. Uh, but what's even harder to understand is when they don't. And I have found that a lot of the times it's you agree with me or you are unduly influenced by biased information. And I don't know if that's the case. What do you think about bias in news sources?
Yeah, I think one of the most exciting possibilities that historical newspapers offer, and this is something where I say, always contact us if you have a question about how to find different newspapers. We're going to do some today, but there's always more out there. Is to explore the possibility of finding reportage from multiple kinds of newspapers, right? So
Yeah.
reportage on, the civil rights from the New York Times, and then also from, the New York Amsterdam News, right? A historically Black-owned newspaper and part of the Black press. So I think that's something where we would love to help people. And also it's important for readership today, even, right? Is finding reporting on the same topic in multiple sources. And I do think even where any person or newspaper wants to be as objective as possible, there are always ways where the assumptions around audience and publishing can affect what a newspaper even chooses to cover. So there can be
Yeah.
bias in how events are covered, but then bias in what events are even understood to be important enough to be covered. And so that's where I think one of the most fun things that we can try to help folks do is find that sort of multiple sourcing and really push for a broad type of coverage of different events.
I think that's a really good point, that and this is why we as researchers, when anybody writes a paper, looks at all the literature we can find about a topic. And when you write a paper, you're typically asked to find a handful of sources depending on the length of the paper. But we look for multiple sources so that we get that balance of opinions and can mention in our work that this side has this perspective, this side has another. And when we talked about reference sources, Russell and I discussed those opposing viewpoints kind of databases, global
Mm-hmm.
issues, and how to give you those multiple perspectives in a concise way. Newspapers are similar in that they tend to be concise and easy to understand, but you have to do the work to understand their point of view and how it might differ from others. One other thing I like about newspapers, and this is not every newspaper that does this, but very often when research happens, especially when it is medical research or science research, it makes the news. So the New York Times often has a section in the paper. And, it's been so long since I've had anybody do this assignment and come to me for help that I'm not entirely sure how much it's done. But many classes were asked to find a piece from the New York Times science column talking about the recent research being done, finding the original article that they're talking about and seeing if they interpreted it accurately. Because, again, with bias, it's not necessarily a perspective they want to promote, but the clarity of what the research article was. But if you're trying to find out what's going on the cutting edge of research, very often people have access to newspapers when they don't have access to scholarly databases like you currently do at UMass Lowell. This is limited access. You don't get to keep it as alumni. But while you're here, you do. And when you're no longer here, you have public libraries and some newspapers that will report on the research being done. Are there other uses for newspapers that come to you while we're talking?
Depending on how you have access to the newspaper, what in some ways we think of as supplementary material can also be vital. And by that, I mean advertisements, movie listings, right? If you have sort of PDF access. So what I mean here is that sometimes we get newspapers through what is called an aggregator. And that is, excuse me, a database that kind of takes the content, the words of a newspaper article, and they're the same accurate words, reformats that into text and puts it together with a bunch of other newspapers. Often then we don't have advertisements or the sort of layout of what a newspaper looked like. But in other cases, we get historical newspapers and we have the PDF and it replicates the full page of what you can see. And whether we like it or not, advertising shapes a lot of how we understand the world. And so part of what can be incredibly interesting, and there are lots of sort of a long history of research in this area, is looking at, what did advertisements for women's fashion look like in the 1930s? What did advertisements for cars? There were cars in the 1930s, right? What did those look like, right? And that in and of itself, the research into the photos, and I didn't even mention photos, but of course that's another big piece, right? Research into the visual elements of newspapers can be a whole exciting area.
Yeah, especially for those in business programs looking at advertising, or in the sociology program, or even psychology looking at the influence of advertising. You want to see examples. And it's sometimes difficult to get the full page image, but many archives, including our own Center for Lowell History, have these microfilm, which I suspect most of our students have only interacted with in video form because they've seen a movie that, like, someone goes to do research on something from the 70s and they're like, the scroll of the microfilm screen goes past them, and what they're using is a way that newspapers are typically archived, especially historically. The digitization of information is only something we've been doing for the past maybe 30 years, not even at the scope that we think it's being done. There are so many newspapers that have no real strong visual archive because it's expensive, and storage is, they're huge files that take a lot of space on hard drives and in storage. So when we do things like this, we often have to partner with big publishers and big vendors to do this kind of work. So they do exist. Sometimes we have access, sometimes we don't. And if you are doing that level of research, we'll certainly do what we can do to get you into those collections. Well, let's start with the actual newspaper sources we definitely have access to. Today, we're going to talk about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and the Lowell Sun. And I was going to save the Lowell Sun to the end, but I think I want to start there because it's a very unique situation. And I'm going to do it from the library webpage because it allows me the chance to show the journal by title search. So when you don't know if we have a certain publication, be it a journal, a newspaper, or a magazine specifically, so these periodically published items, which is why we call them periodicals, the journal by title search will help you see if we have it, and if so, what the range of dates are for our collection. So you just type in what you want. Lowell Sun, and you search. And it comes up with no results found. This is something that has happened relatively recently. And we're going to look at the tool that we used to have it through because it is another source of smaller papers. but the Lowell Sun got pulled out of it. It's Nexus Uni. And actually, I was going through my t-shirts to clean out for spring cleaning, and I realized I have a LexisNexis t-shirt. This is how old it is. So your professor might call something LexisNexis, but it is now called Nexus Uni. And we are going to look at it, and I will mention that again. So what's going on with the Lowell Sun? We no longer have access to the Lowell Sun, either current or historical, digitally. We have some of the historical content from 1878 to 2000 at the Center for Lowell History on microfilm. And Tony and Carissa, and if Nikki's working that day, they're happy to help you use that machine. You do not have to figure that out on your own. But if you need current issues, we encourage you to go to Pollard Memorial Library in downtown Lowell, or if you live in another town, your local library, and look for a subscription to newspaper archives. And ask their reference librarians. Do not wander through their webpage looking for it. Don't waste that kind of time. Go to the people who know if they have it and how to access it, because they will help you. But in many cases, you can only use it on site. You can't use it electronically. So they will help you get access to it. And very often, newspaper archives does have those full images of the articles and the advertising so that you can see what was going on, not just the words on the paper. And this is, if you've never used it before, our Ask a Librarian FAQs, where you can type in the question you have, and if we've already answered it, it will show up with links like this one. And then it will also suggest other ones. You can see this one gets a lot of views because a lot of you have assignments where you're asked to find the Lowell Sun. And this is what's going on. And then our archivists, Tony Sampas's email is right here, including sending questions to the Center for Lowell History. So we have some links here that will help you. Unfortunately, we do not have the Lowell Sun. Back to our webpage. Now we'll start on the ones we do have easy access to, like the New York Times. My suggestion is start with databases. Now you can do the A to Z, but if you go to database type, there's newspapers and magazines, and this will be where a lot of those links that you need will be found, including the Boston Globe. The Alternative Press Index does very small niche international papers that might not get coverage anywhere else. But here's the New York Times, and we have two different collections. We have our historical collections, which is those downloadable PDFs, not the text. And that goes up to 2014, which is not, I know for some of us that feels like it was just a year ago, and for others of us it might feel like literally half your life ago. But our current New York Times coverage is from 1985 to the present. These are not going to be the full images like the PDFs. They're typically just the text of the article. So for some of you, that's going to be great. You just want to read the current articles. Some of you might be frustrated, especially between 2014 and 2003. Unfortunately, we won't be able to, with our collection, get you those PDFs in that date range. So, but let's look at the New York Times, the current collection. And I'm going to apologize. I think my connection is very slow today, even though I turned off all the other devices. Comcast, that's just Comcast. So we have this collection through the Gale OneFile database. This means many of your local public libraries will have this access to. What's today's date? It's the 27th. You can see it's not always immediate, like dawn or 2 a.m., but here it is about 12:30, and we can see today's issue of the paper. And it's got 50 articles. Is this the entire paper? Not really, because it doesn't have the ads. It might not have any of the smaller supplemental sections that we mentioned earlier, but it is going to have the main articles. It tells you date, how many words. that this is an article. I think that I don't know what this is, the 1210L. Do you know what that is, Amanda? Is it the
No,
page of the paper?
no. Is that a Lexile? Like a LexisNexis doesn't encode. Sorry, Gale might encode things with a reading level.
Yeah, maybe. Let's click on the article. That's the
Yeah.
best way to find anything out.
Oh yeah,
Alexa measure.
Lexile.
You were accurate. You were right. So this is sort of their information about it. But you can see this is the article. The authors, again, they are always going to be links in our databases so that you can find all the other articles they have written. And here it is for you to read and interact with, because here are your citations. Always something important, the citation. And in our major 4 styles, links to Noodle tools, if you're using that for your bibliography. I think the RIS is for all the big ones, like if you're going to use, which is the one that we have, EndNote, that's the file format you use. And if you're using Zotero, you can use the RIS file, but I think Zotero, if you're using the correct plugin, might just be able to pull the data from this page itself.
Yeah, it should. Yep, the RIS. It can also take the RIS download.
Yeah,
but
and we will help you with Zotero and EndNote. And some of us do remember RefWorks enough to help you with that, or Noodle tools. We will help you as much as we can with citations. One thing I like here is that you can put some highlights and notes. You do have to create an account most of the time with something like this, but you can see that anybody, I think you can view all the highlights and notes people have left, or yours. Sometimes it really just depends on which article it is. But you can go through and make references and come back and easily get to the things that you thought were interesting for your own papers. And then, of course, we have our downloads and prints and links, and they're all here as well as you get further down. If you're using Google to store content, you can sync with your Google Drive. Same with Dropbox or OneDrive for Microsoft. Sorry, not Dropbox, OneDrive. So it does make it easy for you to sync these with the campus's resources, because we are using Microsoft OneDrive as our file sharing platform. So the New York Times, really easy to use. You can also, let's go back to our main page of the paper. You can search within the publication. It's a very simple search. We can see, let's see if they wrote anything about UMass Lowell. I don't think so, but who knows these days? We have a lot of experts who are experts in their field and getting quoted by the New York Times. So looks like we have 195 references in the New York Times, which is pretty impressive for me. I mean, how often do you think your little university is going to get referenced in a major newspaper? But here is the articles that reference us. So you can see it's a very basic search, but we do have these filters on our right: the publication date, subjects, the Lexile measure, the publication title, which we know, and then you can even search within that set of results for even more specific ones. So if you want to just get all those articles that reference Raytheon 2, we can see if there's more than just this one. And now we just get the one that mentions UMass Lowell and Raytheon. And yes, we can still get smaller with a search set. So you can keep going. They will let you include articles that contain images. So let's take off the Raytheon. And what it means by images is not ads, but images that might be in the article itself. And you can see now there's nothing. These were probably just simple text ones. And if there were images, they weren't saved. Mm-hmm. Anything you think that I missed for the New York Times that you think people might be interested in?
I think you got everything. You know, one thing that I remembered with the Lexile number, which I haven't looked at in a while, but is if you are teaching in a K through 12 classroom, or if you're in the School of Education, that can be an interesting way to find articles relevant to your students. So that's where you can set, I don't remember what the correspondence are, but a Lexile is basically like the reading level, right? So somewhere there's going to be a list of Lexile and grade level. So you can look for, I don't know how the New York Times would do, but you can try to look for articles that would be, you know, at a middle school reading level or a high school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you are someone who's doing that kind of research and wants us to expand on that, submit your question to Ask a Librarian. I think this is the kind of work that our team would love to help you. Like, when I say love to help you with, not just like to help you with, like, this is the kind of deep dive that we just get excited about. And there is someone on our team who's going to be like, listen to what I've discovered. And we have meetings where we talk about the cool questions you all ask us and how much we get to learn from your questions. So do not hesitate to ask us to help you with this. We just need an excuse. I'm already like, I've just made a note to myself at my own lunch, which will be after this, look up Lexile numbers and write the FAQ. And I'm like, that's not my job, but I want to know now. So the interesting things I learn on these live streams. All right. We're going to move on. This is the current access New York Times, but we have this historical collection, and it's not from the same company. What Gale is really good at is providing current access. They have a lot of great relationships with publishers to do that. But ProQuest is one of our publishers that does a number of great archival collections. And as I mentioned, this one goes back to 1851, and it looks like they have added 5 years since we put that list together, which reminds me I should historical is now 5 years. We can update our records to reflect that, which is exciting, which means there's less of a time gap. So if you had those 5 years and you were a little now you have them. So let's use UMass Lowell again. And let's see if anything comes up. This is one where it's not going to give you a list of those publications and you just go to it. It's going to require you search, and it will have those advanced search features. We haven't really looked at any ProQuest databases so far in these live streams, but you might have been in a class where a librarian came and talked to you about ProQuest resources. They're just like EBSCO. They're just a different company, but they provide a lot of the same access. And again, our toolbar for control is on the left. There's not going to be a ton with the New York Times because it's not, with many of our databases, the bucket is so big that you need a lot of features to help you narrow down your results. But here, your big concern is probably date range and document type, and if it's full text or not. And of course, how you organize your search results. So it's just doing the most recent one. But if we tighten up our date range, we can see why are there so few references to UMass Lowell before 1991? Probably because we weren't UMass Lowell before 1991. We were a different university and a different college throughout history. So the bulk of the references to UMass Lowell are going to be in the last 50 years. Keep this in mind with any search. How we talk about something can evolve and mean the same thing. So multiple search terms are very helpful. I'm just going to look at the first one because this is not a huge deep dive into searching, but here is your full text PDF. And here is your page view PDF. What's the difference? Not much. But you see the full page here, which is the column next to it, not just the section with the article in question. So when Amanda had mentioned those full PDFs where you could see the article and the advertising, That's the difference. The full page, the full text is just the PDF of the article. If you would wanted to see also the ads around it or the articles next to it, that page view is your best bet. We can see here it's a sports section article, so we know which section of the paper it's coming from. The first page is probably the page in the paper because they would code the pages with like a shorthand so that you could see in the index where the section is and then go to it. And this would be the little printed, like it would be a little box on the paper that would say, this article, it's my go-to as a child was comics, like 1C in the paper that I read as a kid. I always went to the comics first. I didn't really care about the news for a while. This has the copyright, the basic information. Again, download your PDF, site. Well, let me move this up a little. Site, email, print, other options. They have so many options: Google Classroom, Google Drive, OneDrive, RefWorks, EndNote, Noodle Tools, EasyBib. Again, Zotero should be able to use the same file EndNote uses or the RIS file, or just click on the plugins icon on your browser window. I'm on Chrome. I don't think there is a Chrome Zotero. I believe is it still Firefox only? Or have they updated?
Yeah, there's one for Chrome now. Yeah.
Yeah. If you have your own account with ProQuest, you can save this to your research. Again, that would be a free account from them. This is just so you can, especially if you're doing a long-term project like a thesis or dissertation, or you're working with a professor through the semester on their research, having a file to store it in is helpful. All right, let's go back to our results. This is a pretty easy database to use because it is just one publication. So it's really about finessing those search terms. Amanda, is there anything that you noticed that I didn't point out?
Well, I think you already hit on the strongest one, which are the search terms. I think particularly for these older newspapers, sometimes the OCR, the optical character recognition, how the machine knows to match your text to what is actually on the page, can be a little bit messy. And the way that you pointed out not being able to find records for UMass Lowell before UMass Lowell existed, I think is such a key point to also remember. You know, if you're doing research on Myanmar, right, then you'll want to also include Burma. And things like country names change over time, particularly as it's tied to things like, for example, colonization, right? So one of, I think, the most interesting things about this is that you kind of end up in your head with almost a history of how a term has been used. Yeah. And you can imagine all sorts of terms that we know about where older terms may seem surprising or offensive. And that is definitely something that you will run across and need to work within your search strategy. So I think that point about vocabulary and changes over time is really a key point when you're working with historical newspapers.
Yeah, that's a really good point because, and I made this joke to my parents. I was visiting them and we went into a storage unit and found an encyclopedia set they had invested in when my sister and I were children, and my mother argued in favor of keeping it. And she turned to me as the librarian who enjoys books and wants to keep books. And I shook my head because I said to her, it probably references the USSR and Rhodesia. Those two things alone are reasons that we don't buy encyclopedias anymore. You can't keep up with these things, but you might need those in historical research, not the encyclopedias. You don't need those. You need the news sources. You need to see maybe that transition where we publicly stopped talking about a country one way and started talking about it another, and what was going on in the world when that happened. Because this is, the international political ecosystem. Everything influences everything else. And how the news presents it is such an interesting way of seeing through through the lens of somebody's world. And that's the New York Times. It is one of our nation's leading papers. So when we look at it, we're looking at the national news, not just New York Times. The same is about the Wall Street Journal. These are our national papers, but this one tends to focus a little more on finances and not just the full coverage of what's going on. We do not have a historical collection for the Wall Street Journal, but our current collection does go back to 1984. Unless they've changed that too. It's quite possible because these companies continue to expand their collections. And this one is also from ProQuest. So a lot of the features you just saw, the placements, the organizations of that page, how the search works, it's all going to be relevant. But like when we were looking at that Gale list, we were focused on one publication. Now we can choose an issue and look at that. So here we are. Choose your issue to view 2023, March 27th, 2023. We're taken right into the current articles collection, the day's publications. This is not necessarily organized in order of publication in the paper. And this is what I have found very often when we compare these collections to the digital publication of the paper. Some things get left out that are exclusively digitally published. So if you're looking at the digital paper and you can't get access, you're like on the Wall Street Journal's webpage, you are certainly welcome to try searching for it here in the paper today. But there might be some that just don't get included because they're not the paper's publication, they're the digital editions publications. It's weird. It's about money. We do what we can do when those situations come up to get you access to the article you really need. So do not hesitate to do interlibrary loan in those cases. But if you hit a wall here, it's probably the reason. So you can search within your issue. You can, of course, change your issue. This is only showing us March 2023 because we're here, March 2023. It's going to increasingly narrow, but here we can have access to January and February. And now we're back to 1982. I'm going to make a note of that. We will tell our digital team that that these have been increased. It's always exciting when you have more access for me. Yeah. So let's look at one article. You notice there's no full text PDF image. Even though this is the same company that put that historical New York Times together, this is not their historical collection. So it is just the full text of these articles. And this is very cool. They have suggested sources for you that are related to this. Not necessarily in the Wall Street Journal. It's sometimes, yes, but this is Dow Jones Institutional News. Another Dow Jones, but mostly Wall Street Journal. And you can view more of them. You can search within their indexing terms. Those are the controlled words that librarians and information organizers like to keep everything grouped together so that you can find things. So if you're really here to learn about gold and violence, which, ooh, fun. But if you're looking at a specific country like Ghana or the continent of Africa, because many African countries have these precious metal reserves or mines, if you want to focus on the region of South Africa or someone specifically or in relation to the US, you can. Because this is more like our traditional article collection, not an archival, sort of standalone, isolated collection like that historical New York Times collection was. Anything that piques your interest, Amanda?
Do you mean of our Article
Of our Wall
results.
Street Journal collection. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Um, I think also and I can't remember if the facets get this detailed or not, but I think the sort of sometimes comparing the difference between the reporting and the opinion pages is
Mm.
sometimes also going to be an interesting difference. And right now, I am forgetting exactly how it appears in the journal here, but um, that's, I think, also something that folks are probably familiar with, and you've already mentioned it. But some, and I think the Wall Street Journal is one, some newspapers have particularly influential opinion sections.
Mm. I think that's a really good point. The letters to the editor section is often a source of interesting local perspectives, not especially in local papers. When you get, I mean, people will joke about the letters to the editor, but you're getting someone's opinion about what is going on rather than the reporter's perspective. But often the paper's editor has, and sometimes the owner has their own perspective of an issue that they specifically want to share. Now, I've gone to the advanced search of this search engine, this database. This is not necessarily just a collection of the Wall Street Journal. This has other publications in it that
Right.
we have focused in on the Wall Street Journal. So a lot of these advanced features might not be relevant to what's included in the paper, but if there are any advertisements, this might be a way to get them. And if you scroll down, you'll have something called an editorial. Editorials are from the editor. They're opinion pieces, editorial cartoons. You've seen those. Some of our best loved artists, Dr. Seuss, used to be an editorial cartoon artist around World War II. So some of our most beloved artists and children's books illustrators had careers in a much more adult context. You'll maybe find a section that says letters, no letters to the editor. Yes, letters to the editor. Those are the people in the world sending their editorial. And occasionally you will have something that says opinion. No, they don't have that on this database. But the editorial letter, the letter to the editor, the editorial column, these are all words that would imply that you're limiting it to those opinion pieces. And they might have value in the research that you're doing, especially in historical research. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a great one. That this database, I think, does a better job in doing. This company, because they are primarily focused on college and university researchers, do have a lot of these great bells and whistles that are helpful for you. All right. We're going to move right into the next paper, the Boston Globe. This is our state paper, one of the two big ones, the other being the Boston Herald, which we do not have access to. The bias on the Herald is pretty well established and not something we will talk about. You can use the journal by title to search Boston Herald. See what comes back. And you can see, the Zion Herald. How fun. But there doesn't seem to be any collection with the Boston Herald, which doesn't make sense. I feel like Nexus Uni should have it, but we'll get to that. But the Boston Globe is what we have. We have some different points of access. Anything from pre-1997, typically about 1980 to 1996, is in one collection. And then everything from 89 forward is in this other one. So let's start with the current Boston Globe, because you're going to recognize it. It's ProQuest. So I'm not going to go too in depth. It works just like that Wall Street Journal search did. You can limit to your date. And again, we're on the 27th, so we can see today's paper. Not always at the beginning of the day, again, just for a reminder, but typically at some point in time during the day, you will get today's issue. And then I'll put quotes around historical because it does go back to 1980, which for a few of us are our current lifetimes, but for many of us is historical. Again, we have the Boston Globe in ProQuest. So these are just two different collections. I'm not entirely sure why they've been split up. I suspect it has to do with the way these companies build their individual databases. And we know this from EBSCO also. They own and create multiple databases with different focuses. And sometimes they don't have the rights to include everything in everything. So it gets split up between different databases. So in this case, ProQuest has split up this historical-ish collection from a more current collection. Oh, no, wait. Yeah, I was looking at the dates and thinking, no, we're wrong, but it's right. This is the pre-97 collection. So you just have to click on the link depending on the date you need. And sometimes you might not know that date and you do want to search both. Anything I should mention about the Boston Globe that I didn't think about? Because it's the same company, so I don't want to go too in depth because we have Nexus Uni next.
Yeah, no, I think you got it all. I would say if people are ever curious about more Massachusetts newspapers, we can help them find stuff at the Boston Public Library, which is sort of the regional depository. But that's all I would say about that. I think you got everything else.
And the interesting thing about Massachusetts specifically, and I suspect until the last decade and a half, a lot of towns had small little local papers. And it was not always easy to find them. And that's where databases like the Alternative Press Index come in, or Nexus Uni. So again, if you didn't hear before, we also called it LexisNexis. And if you are an experienced researcher, you know there's actually a difference between Lexis and Nexus Uni. One is an amazing legal research tool that lawyers live for. They love I think it's Lexis is the legal one. And then Nexus had like more business content. And then they put them together in sort of an academic platform for undergraduates and graduate students that weren't doing such niche research. And then they rebranded a few years ago, pre-pandemic, and now they're Nexus Uni. And this combines the strengths of both with more news content. And once it loads up, you will get to see. So if you're doing business research, this is a database where you can get a lot of company info. If you're doing law research, legal research, you can get cases and law reviews. It's not as expansive as their main products, but for the work most of our students are doing, especially our undergraduates, this is a good starting point. But their main claim to fame is their news research. So you can limit to specific publications, specific topics. It's not always the easiest search engine to use for people, but they do have some specific topics that they cover. And then you can search for a publication. And you can see here, it says find publication. It doesn't have the Boston Herald, but you can see as I start typing things in, it suggests what publication I might want. And yes, there's a lot of legal things here. I'm trying to think of something. Let's see if we do Lowell. No, it doesn't come up with anything. So if you're looking for a specific publication, this is the way to help you. If you're looking for news, let's see.
Now I'm just curious. Now let's just try.
The spring. We're
try towns around Massachusetts.
Yeah, well, and Springfield has that added bonus of having a town named Springfield in almost every state.
This is true.
And I think any fan of The Simpsons will give you the long list of potential states that the Springfield of The Simpsons falls in. But here we have Springfield News Online. So if we search for that, oh, no, it needed some search terms. Let's enter some search terms. Let's do military. Now, notice I didn't use that top bar. We'll get back to that. So there's nothing in the Springfield News Online that mentions the military or the word military. So if I open up this menu here, I can see some of those options again. These are legal things. Here's the news things. This is something I love about Nexus Uni. This is not just your traditional paper, even legacy news sources. This includes the editorials and letters and comments, but broadcast transcripts of news on television. It includes some major blogs, newswires. The AP, the Associated Press, is a newswire. When something happens and it had to get distributed to papers around the country, it would go through these newswires, especially for international news. Magazines and journals, web links, university newspapers. I don't think we're included. Nothing came up with Lowell, but some big universities might have their newspaper included in this collection. So you get so much content that you might not find otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Amanda, is there anything you like to search? Oh, yes, and obituaries. Is there anything you like to use Nexus Uni to search for?
I'm trying to remember. I think the business and industry news limited on sort of a regional, if you can. I think when you search that and then look for sort of not the major world publications, right? Sometimes you can pick up really interesting regional business news, reporting on the Chamber of Commerce decisions in a particular area. And especially for those who are interested in sort of place-specific entrepreneurship, sometimes that's a reference question we get that can pull up interesting things. So yeah, what's this, Chamber of Commerce in Wales?
I just did the business industry news, searched for the phrase Chamber of Commerce. This is something that Nexus Uni does so much better than other. I mean, there's a lot of struggles with Nexus Uni and its user friendliness, but the way it also shares information is so much better than others. So here we can see it's actually highlighting our phrase in our search results. And we have over 10,000 that mention a Chamber of Commerce. So this speaks to how much of that was, some of it's legal news too, which makes some sense. To speak to your point that this is content we might not be able to find otherwise. So England and Wales, we can now go and include or exclude if we're seeing things come up that maybe we don't want to include England or UK. Always use your or when you have multiple ways of talking about something. It's still got a ton. It's still bringing back the England and Wales. That's interesting. But it might not be referenced in the or UK. No. Did I include that accidentally? But you can see that it's now highlighting the UK so that we can see. It does give us a timeline so that we can play with our time frame. We can see that the references really pick up in the last, let's see here. Since 2004. This is probably when they added some of this collection more than when this collection got really popular in things. We can go by location and focus on specific states, not just countries. If we want industry, if it's identified that kind of content, it might be important. Geography by document, which isn't necessarily going to be the same as
Mhm.
location, and geography by document sometimes is a little different, a little broader. This one's interesting. Negative news.
Yeah.
I don't, I'll have to look up what that is.
Mhm. Hmm.
If you have specific people who you might want to have mentioned, uh, Boris Johnson, clearly that's going David Cameron, Theresa May. These are very likely the UK papers. So if we go and we focus on, let's say, California, it's a huge state, 116 from Alaska. So now we've got a much more US focus. We can take off this UK or England. And we can see California's business and industry. And you can see a whole new set of industries, geography by document, negative news, people. Now we have Jerry Brown and Arnold Schwarzenegger because they're probably referencing local politicians. Some of our viewers might not be old enough to remember this, but Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor of California for quite a while. So that's always a fun little memory. He wasn't the worst governor they've had. Anything I should point out about Nexus Uni that I haven't mentioned yet?
No, that's great. And I feel like it's so interesting to me because the more I use Nexus Uni, I feel like often my impulse is to try to put in, I'm curious what you think, and our audience can try these out or tell us later. I'm often tempted to look at the advanced search and try to put together a perfect search to start. But in some ways, I think what works best here is a really broad search and then using their facets to the left, the way that you have, right? That it's just kind of a persnickety database and it sort of knows how itself is organized, if that makes sense. So by doing this Chamber of Commerce, right, like that's a pretty broad search, but then you were able to use all of those facets to the left to narrow it down rather than starting very particular at the start.
Yeah. One of the things I particularly like about Nexus Uni is how good their search within results feature is at
Yeah.
narrowing content, because you're seeing those results come back. Looking at the article itself, it does have some interesting features. Here's your export, your citation. Searching within the document is very strong here. They tell you how many words, who the byline is, the section of the paper in this case, and then your classification details, which are sometimes their organizational system. But one thing that the other databases don't do that I love here is they don't just tell you the subjects. They tell you, ooh, and of course it wants to be like, do you want to add that to your search? Another Nexus Uni. They tell you how much of the article is actually about that
Yeah.
topic. So this is 91% of this article is about appointments and associations and organizations and the Chamber of Commerce. So it gives you a good idea of what they're actually discussing in a way that you might not get. And if this is not that long of an article, so it might not be that big of a deal. But when you're dealing with many page articles, to have this breakdown of someone saying, only 72% of this is about labor and employment, but 91% of it is about appointments, really can help you decide if this is worth your time to read. And I mean, the answer might be yes, of course it's worth my time to read. And in other cases, you might not have a lot of time on your hands. If any person researches the way we have assumed our students research, you're probably
Mhm.
doing it at the last minute. Or even if you don't normally do your research at the last minute, you could be looking for that just one more source. And knowing that this is not entirely about your topic by like 60%, that means you just skip it and go to the next one. And that's a great way to help you manage your time within this. And it's something that Google doesn't always do very well. Again, we have our print, our email, our download. We have Google Drive. We have Microsoft OneDrive. We have this go-to, which will help you go through the sections of this, see the different terms, where they show up, search within the document, and then you can change your language, which more and more of these do. As I understand it, this is an AI tool, and I only say that because we are so very aware of AI versus human touch right now. So Google Translate tends to be an AI feature. That does not mean it's bad. It just means it's not perfect and tends to be literal. And then, of course, if you want more, here's our source so that you can go find more. But I mentioned, let's go back to our search home. I mentioned earlier that I didn't go to that top search bar right away. And that's because I'm used to using this database. You can use this search. There's nothing wrong with it. But this doesn't give you the control the guided search gives you. So it's only going to default to the previous 2 years, but you can change that. It's going to search everything, but you can change that. You have your advanced search. They have tips. I've never used the doc assistants, but you can get some help from them on how to use it, especially with legal research, which is not always fun and easy, but it is here for you, especially if it's a question that we struggle to answer. We might actually just go to that doc research. So you can, in the guided search, narrow down to specifically just the news, the cases, publications, law reviews, company, country. It's a different experience. And when you know you're here and you just want news or a specific publication, I tend to go right to the guided search. But there's no right or wrong. There's just the way you use it. What else do you like about Nexus Uni? Anything that I'm forgetting?
No, I think this is great.
And there are, of course, going to be things that you might uncover over time. It is 1:03. So to the person who is here, that is not us. Thank you for staying a little longer. I think we've covered everything we wanted to cover. And my final push is always to remind everybody about Ask a Librarian. And if you're on our library webpage, Amanda, Russell, and Artemis, I think it's Russell and Artemis are doing our in-person drop-in sessions this week. They have two this week.
Yes,
or three.
Yep, I'll be there. Yeah, some combination of all three or 2 or 3 of us will be there. Yep.
Yeah, so we're doing research for the humanities and an introduction to library research this week. So please come to the library. And then if you have a question that we didn't answer or you can't find it anywhere else, go to Ask a Librarian, search our FAQs, send us your question via email. You can call, but we're not always available. But you can, if chat is online, you can live chat with us. And this is a great feature for our online only students who still want our help. We are here to help you too. You are not any different from a student who comes to a desk or finds a librarian. You can get our help too. And our evenings for chat, our times for chat are in the evenings so that you can have access when you're actually likely to be working on it, as opposed to when we are working, which is probably the same time you have jobs. If you're an online student, you might have multiple demands on your time. So do not hesitate to reach out to us for help. We want to make sure you have everything you need so that you can get the grades you want for your paper and your classes and graduate and get jobs and be happy. Have happy, productive lives, whatever that looks like. Anything else you want to add before we end this?
No, thank you. This was really fun. And yes, get a hold of us. We're happy to work with you.
I will see you all next week. I can't remember what we're talking about yet, but I think we have in the month of April, we're going to be discussing some business, some engineering sources, We will try our best to get back to JSTOR before the semester ends because we know it's a popular one. So watch the webpage and our social media for information about when that is, and like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel to get notified when other live streams are scheduled. And with that, thank you all and have a great afternoon. And thank you, Amanda, for joining me again.
Thanks, everyone.